First of all, I'd really love to thank all of the attendees for your enthusiasm and your care for your students. As Ariana said, I'm a doctoral student at Boston College. I got my MA in Asian American Studies from UCLA, and that's where I was trained in ethnic studies pedagogy. I've been really privileged to apply that training at Dartmouth College for the past couple of years as an adjunct professor of history. This presentation is going to explore some of those experiences and reflect on what it's meant for me and my students to teach each other ethnic studies in an effective and fulfilling way. Oh, amazing. It looks like most of you have had these discussions in the classroom, kind of contextualizing your students' experiences in this wider societal context. And I can imagine that it's very emotionally taxing, especially with the current racial atmosphere that we're experiencing in the United States, but also kind of in North America as a whole. So I am really interested to hear your thoughts, and I'm going to invite you to share them after the presentation. Okay, so let's go to slide 2. So first of all, I'd like to contextualize what ethnic studies is, what its origins are, and why that matters. So ethnic studies broadly, we can think of as teaching from the margins, right? It's a way of learning that centers the experiences of the people who are historically oppressed and erased from the national historical narrative. But where does this academic tradition kind of emerge from? And we actually know very explicitly. So again, departments in ethnic studies were formally created in 1968 after the longest student strike in American history, and this starts at San Francisco State College and UC Berkeley, which grew out of protests against the firing of Black Panther Party Minister of Education George Murray from the SFSC English department. The Third World Liberation Front, which is a coalition of Black, Latino, and Asian organizations formed by students, essentially protested this decision, as well as what they saw as racist admissions policies and a white supremacist curriculum. So these are local students to the San Francisco Bay Area who are, for the first time, kind of taking this new racial awareness that they've gotten from the activism of the civil rights era, and they're saying, okay, so how do I uplift my community? How do I get resources from the university in order to, help out with, businesses or community service, all of these kinds of things. So from their point of view, they're at school to get an education that empowers them to uplift their communities. But instead, they're being taught essentially that they're not part of the curriculum. They don't matter. They are criminal, especially in terms of Black studenthood in the Bay Area. And essentially that they don't really exist in terms of the dominant national narrative, right? If you are taught about your history, it is as kind of this minority exceptional narrative. So they're saying essentially, we want resources at our university departments and in our communities to reflect the history that we know is there, but don't necessarily have the time or resources to gather ourselves. So out of this 5-month strike, we see ethnic studies as we know it today. The field of ethnic studies grows out of these departments that are established in the aftermath of the Third World Liberation Front strikes. And unfortunately, these courses that are taught at the collegiate level are some of the only places where students have this formal space within academia to discuss, frankly, issues of racial politics, to examine their own ethnic identities and learn these marginalized histories. But thankfully, as a lot of you know, that's changing. So since 2023, for example, the LA Unified School District has ethnic studies classes as one of their graduation requirements, which is incredible. And I have the honor of knowing a lot of instructors at the middle and high school levels who either teach ethnic studies or incorporate ethnic studies into their curricula. So that is amazing to me. I think Those of you who work K-12 are just incredible. So given this context, ethnic studies to me isn't about communicating information. It's about helping students to train themselves in a way of thinking and knowledge making, right, that emphasizes community mindedness. In other words, it's not just about their ability to retain information or facts. It's about helping them build the skills to make observations and act on them collaboratively with others outside of the classroom. So essentially to take this information back to their community, just as the TWLF kind of intended. So since this demand for ethnic studies was initially liberatory and community focused, I think it should be taught in a complementary way. So let's dive into a case study. Essentially, how do we actually do this in the classroom? So I had the wonderful opportunity to adapt some of my course material into a curricular resource for the ILC last year. I believe that's the South Asian American History Resource Roundup. It is a wonderful collaboration, and I highly recommend you take a look at it if you are thinking about teaching South Asian American history in your classroom. So let's dive into that. So briefly, the course module that I adapted is our first unit on South Asian American immigration to the United States. So we start the course by basically asking a few fundamental questions: the who, what, when, where, why. So who were the first South Asian immigrants to the United States? And the answer is generally Sikh men from the Punjab region of what was then British India. And why did they come to the US? So we have to contextualize this immigration movement within India's diverse cultures, right? Sikh men back then were highly mobile. Many were recruited into service in the colonial British Army. It was also a fairly common practice back then due to, the British Empire's impoverishment of the Indian economy to send one or more of their sons abroad to basically secure additional lines of financial support for a family. And a lot of them come to the United States in the early 1900s after the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So essentially after the Emancipation Proclamation in the mid 19th century, we have this turn away from slavery and the enslavement of Black people as the United States' primary source of cheap labor. The force that is brought in to replace them is actually a lot of Chinese immigrants referred to as coolies. After 1882, there is once again the scramble for cheap labor, and that's where we find kind of the story of South Asian immigrants connecting to this racial history that we see in the United States in the early 20th century. So a lot of them are working for Californian agribusinesses that are located mostly in the Central Valley. So a lot of them settle in the Central Valley to work on farms. And they find success because of their experience working the farmlands of the Punjab region, which has a similar climate. And we see a lot of these immigrants in their writing, in their poetry, compare the new regions that they're in to their homelands, right? It's this kind of really poetic, nostalgic affection for their homelands that they're writing about. And also a way of kind of reconciling their immigrant identities to this absolutely new racial hierarchy, to this new political environment. And unlike Chinese or later Hindu migrants, Sikhs don't really have strong taboos against interracial or interreligious marriage. And back then, they readily formed families with Mexican women in local immigrant communities. So here I use Karen Isaacson's seminal study, as you can see on the left of your screen. It's called Making Ethnic Choices. And this helps students investigate and understand what these early immigrant communities could look like. So how did they organize themselves? How did they find personal fulfillment? How can we destabilize this idea that racial categories are like super stable and concrete? And how can we build ethnic histories that bridge, for example, Asian and Latino communities or Asian and Black communities? So the text provides details and sociological studies and research that we can engage with through our own research and reflection. So I really like teaching this unit. And that's because it has a really wonderful flexibility to it. We can talk about religion, we can talk about immigration and race, we can talk about gender, we can talk about the changing of all of these factors between the homeland and the new country of settlement. We talk about these two overlapping groups, which are South Asians and multi-ethnic Asians, two groups that tend to be marginalized even within Asian American studies or ethnic studies in general. And for me, it's really important to center these stories in order to help students from these groups form their own community narratives of belonging. So as the previous presenter talked about, and of course the next presenter is going to talk about as well, a lot of these exercises, I think, help students think about themselves not as kind of these isolated points of narrative where they're like, I was born into a community and then I am navigating my own way through life, but also like my story is part of this interconnected chain of stories, right, that have developed in a really complex and interesting way throughout history. And really importantly, these are positive connections that we're making as well. So they go from these narrative anomalies to crucial historical actors, actually. And this can start to restore damaged or severed community bonds. It's also really important for us to talk about religion and its social and spiritual roles. So, for example, religious institutions like the Stockton Gurdwara were crucial to sustaining overseas Sikh communities. There are also these hubs of diasporic political activism. Part of the narrative of immigration that we're trying to destabilize here is that immigration is unidirectional, it's permanent, it's isolating. Basically, that immigrants come from somewhere to the US and they never return, and that diasporic communities are just these quiet pockets of ethnic minorities, which is, as we know, a really mid-century view of immigration and how immigrants kind of acclimatize to their new homes. But here we have this opportunity to really look at South Asian immigration and say, no, actually, people in the diaspora historically maintain really, really active political ties to their homelands. So we can take a look at the Ghadar Party, which is an Indian nationalist organization that was founded by these same Punjabi Sikh immigrants on the West Coast, from California to Oregon. And they advocated basically for decolonization, for the overthrow of the British Empire. They were some of the first kind of organized armed insurgents in that way. And they formed the ideological foundation, or at least part of it, for the Indian independence movement that we saw in the 1930s and 1940s. So here is the crucial connection when we're thinking about diasporic activism. It's that it's actually really crucial to homeland politics. And of course, students can make connections today to current Hindu nationalism and their own knowledge of the conversations that are going on inside their family circles and within their communities. And I think they are able to draw a lot of parallels structurally, as well as see where those historical ties have been able to be built upon by their, frankly, very old and very sophisticated community networks. All right, next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about the approach to this material. So I titled this presentation, Teaching a Collaborative Ethnic Studies. So on this slide, I have a quote from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I'm sure a lot of you have read or at least heard of. But on the off chance that you haven't, Freire here in his book basically argues that we have to stop thinking of students as empty vessels into which we as teachers essentially place information. So for Freire, this is just kind of a replication of the dominant social structures that students encounter outside of the classroom. And it teaches them that their role in society is to be a passive observer that receives information instead of, active agents that shape society to accommodate their needs, right? And it teaches them essentially that they have nothing to contribute in the classroom. And I think it's especially important in ethnic studies to realize that there are certain kinds of information that I have, right? And certain kinds of information that my students have, and that we're coming together really to teach each other. And that's the intellectual legacy, I think, of the activism of the Third World Liberation Front, is that if we are able to build um, kind of these networks of knowledge that serve communities, then it can't be me or any other teacher kind of um, spreading information outwards through this radiating network, right? It has to be bidirectional because I'm also a community member. I am not an outsider that's coming in to tell people how to run their communities. We can do that together, right? Community is collaboration. And especially when it comes to race, students have grown up with this kind of at least folkloric and personal, if not an academic understanding of race and how it works in the United States, right? They are growing up in this era where it is, I think, more than when I was a child, a hot button issue in very complex ways. And they're part of a national discussion that is, because of social media and this growth of mass media, much more involved, I think, peer to peer and community to community than it was back in the early 2000s. So I think it is the teacher's job to help them activate their knowledge in a way that they can personally find constructive, because through ethnic studies, they have this opportunity to examine their own lives and experiences and understand them in a greater societal context. So this is kind of the approach that I keep in mind while I am going into lecturing and kind of leading discussion. All right, so this is all really well and good, but how do we actually do this? I still need to lecture because of how the university system is set up. Unfortunately, there's a huge emphasis on quantitative results, on testing as this way to prove knowledge, right? I also try really hard to provide alternatives to kind of this lecture system and spaces for students to add their own knowledge to what they've already learned in lecture. For example, online components where they get to conduct their own field research, right? They look for primary sources related to the current lecture unit, and they compare their sources to other students' findings according to themes like gender or racialization or economics. And I really encourage them to compare and contrast across what people are like socially categorizing as racial categories, right, as racial lines, but also across gender and across time. So a lot of students actually come into this very historically minded. They're like, why is modern society the way that it is? And they're kind of aware that in order to answer these questions, they have to look into the past. And the further into the past they go, I think the more they find that actually these answers to the questions that they have are surprisingly consistent, right? So for example, why do certain forms of racial tension exist? We go back to the 19th century, we look at legislation, they're able to draw their own conclusions, they're able to kind of do their own reading of the text and figure out kind of, oh, how have I seen this actually play out in my own life? So we also encourage consistent peer-to-peer discussions where we center these student connections to historical material. For example, when I started teaching, it was at the height of COVID during 2022. So we looked at anti-Asian violence, right? And the surge of it during the COVID-19 pandemic, and also anti-Asian lynchings at the turn of the 20th century. And we were also able to compare the careers of early Asian American politicians like Dalip Singh Sand to those of modern politicians like Nikki Haley, um, which, you know, have wildly different positions, but are still part of the same kind of historical trend and legacy. So we also encourage multidisciplinarity and opportunities for creative expression. So for the final example of this course, for the final project of this course, for example, I provide traditional prompts for collegiate, you know, standard 10 to 12 page papers that are focused on kind of student research. But students are also able to propose their own final projects, right? I've gotten students who take the information that they've gathered in class and they create cookbooks. They collate their research into personalized web archives. They create video essays and podcasts, and they write short fiction that reflects historical experiences alongside their own, right? And one of the questions I think that drives these things, at least my thought on why to offer creative kind of option is also what's useful for your portfolio as a student? What's personally important for you? And what skills do you want to build in order to get to those goals, right? So essentially, all of this ethnic studies pedagogy is focused around a couple of questions. What do students want? What kind of knowledge are they interested in? And what are they trying to understand? So this can be anything from personal, community, or racial trauma to pure academic interest. So we can here identify the underlying desires as, I want to understand why my community is so conservative and insular. Or I want to know why modern racial politics are the way that they are. And the underlying goals there might be something like, concretely, I want to be able to stand up to my racist uncle at family dinners when he goes on an anti-immigrant tirade, right? Or I want to start building a foundation of knowledge so that someday I can be a really good immigration lawyer. So it's our job as instructors, I think, to figure out what kind of knowledge they need in this space to activate and absorb in order to get to that goal, right? So I think also the collegiate environment is very unique in that students are often really far away from their homes, right? Especially international students. So it's my hope in taking this approach to collegiate teaching that they're able to return to these communities, no matter how far away they are, and keep thinking politically, to engage politically with history, and remember kind of this importance that we see like valued from the 1960s of people power, of building and maintaining community relationships, and for them to be able to um, advocate or feel kinship with the most vulnerable members of their communities. So that was a very abbreviated series of thoughts on how to approach collaborative teaching on race and ethnicity in a collegiate environment. Thanks for listening. I think we can move into the Q&A section if anybody has questions, but I'd also love to hear any comments that you guys have, either in the chat or the Q&A box. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jess, for coming and talking about this. I also wanted to just give a shout out that Jess actually wrote an essay for us, which Karen, I know, put the link in earlier in the chat about this topic, but more specifically the history, I guess, about South Asian immigration. So I hope you all will check it out. It's a fantastic essay and it's also very short. So it's good for teachers and also for, I guess, high school students also. It's appropriate for that level. So please check it out. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, I had one for you, which is, I know you were talking quite a bit about the collegiate level. Do you have any suggestions for teachers, since we have people from all ages? So with the elementary levels or high school levels, about ways that they can modify and adapt this collaborative approach for their levels?
Sure. I think, again, going back to this idea of the pedagogy of the oppressed, um, really activating previous student knowledge because they do have it no matter how young they are, right? So when we approach teaching about race and ethnicity in the classroom from essentially like the time that they are, because when I talk to my students, they talk about their first experiences of racialization. And I'm sure people have this experience too. They talk about their first experience of racialization occurring as young as preschool, right? So being able to talk about those experiences and activate them and say, so how do you see race? Like, what has your experience been? And how do I help you contextualize this within history or community, I think is really, really valuable and applies to every single age group, no matter like what teaching environment you're in.
I'm wondering also if you have suggestions for where teachers can go to look for different resources when they're teaching about these topics. Are there websites you tend to go to or places that you think have really fantastic resources?
I know that the LAUSD tends to have a lot of resources. I'm not sure how many of them are public, but I've had a lot of colleagues that have shared their resources from LAUSD. So I think that is maybe the first place I would look. Both LA County and Orange County, I think, are the kind of hotbeds of ethnic studies teaching K-12 from what I've seen. So I would definitely look there first. Unfortunately, a lot of my experiences are at the collegiate level, so it's a lot of like books and reading. So I can recommend those to instructors, certainly. But K-12, I definitely start looking in these two particular counties where I've seen a lot of innovation by individual teachers, but also at the board level.
Let's see. I guess my final question for you is if you could give just one piece of advice to teachers, something to leave them with, what would you say?
Um, I think your learning is just as important as your students' learning, right? So when you are engaging your students in courses, I think the way that I measure if I've done a good job is if I walk away from lecture with a lot of unanswered questions that students bring up, right? And that spurs me to engage more inquisitively with what they have on their minds. So I think that is probably the piece of advice that I have.